What's up, guys? We're coming at you with another review here. It's the Unqualified Film Bros podcast, brought to you by. We're not sponsored yet, so we're starting off this. Or I guess we're not starting the year because we did that last week, but off to a great start.
If you'd like to sponsor us, contact us at
flowofficialproductions@gmail.com. Anyway, we are talking about the Golden Globe winner for Best Motion Picture Drama. It is Jane Campion's great film from 2021. Benedict Cumberbatch stars The Power of the Dog. This one was, I want to say, a little bit not what I was expecting, but I really enjoyed it. I don't know about you guys. I know Max and Ben, you included it on your top fives from last year.
It's my number one, so
yeah.
My two.
I had not heard about. Well, I had not heard about it. Like, I'd seen the title, but it had not been on my radar at all until your guys' like recommendation for it. So it's an interesting dichotomy in how I think George and we both had no real prior knowledge of it. Well, you guys
for yourself.
Were big fans. What'd you say?
I said speak for yourself. Yeah, I thought Benny Cumberbatch, Barney Hoot Scrunch was fantastic. Obviously, whenever he does his sort of deep-voiced American accent, I only hear Doctor Strange, but that's because that was the first role I ever saw him do that accent in. But I wouldn't say he disappears or dissolves into his role as Phil Burbank, but he certainly puts up a strong enough performance where you believe him as a rancher, as someone who's lived, out on the plains of the 1920s West throughout his whole life. So he puts up a very real, very authentic performance, which I would say pleasantly surprised by, because I haven't seen him in a role of that quality before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think I like that he didn't quite disappear into the role, because there's some insecurity with the character design, and I think that actually played off of his performance really nicely. He as the movie goes along, details about Phil's past and sort of his relationship with mentor type figures, father figures, is exposed, and a lot of that comes through in aggression and sort of not knowing how to deal with Cody Smith-McPhee, who also won a Golden Globe for his performance as Kirsten Dunst's son in The Power of the Dog. Yeah, Peter. And he, I think their relationship is really fascinating. I hope it's something we talk about more in depth later, but those are my opening thoughts.
Like, I'll just say, to build off of quickly what you were just saying there. I think as the film goes on, I would say it seems to become at mid hinted at that Phil's character is like a persona he's putting on to like protect himself more than his true self per se.
Yeah, he's very guarded.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's I presume we can say full spoilers for the film. We're seeing on Netflix if you haven't seen it yet. He seems to have a persona that he's using to hide his true identity and his true self throughout the film.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on, but just tagging on your points, I would say like the core of the movie is Peter and Phil's relationship, especially at the very end, but just the different ways that they approach life, essentially. And certainly there's like differences in between Phil and what's the other brother's name?
George.
George. Yeah, George.
I
was about to
with
say
him.
that. I was like, that doesn't sound right. But yeah, I mean, I thought like Benedict Cumberbatch that did a great job. I mean, I really loved him in this role. And like you said, he doesn't completely disappear. He's got like sort of a tone to his voice that I think you can always tell. It's not like what he does with the accent or anything. I think he did a fantastic job with that. But yeah, like it is a bit of, a guarded sort of persona.
Mhm.
I always feel that like there's a certain like voice that like British actors doing an American accent have, where they sort of like really flatten and really like state very directly to the no, it's like there's a certain like voice that it's like this is not an American person with an American accent. This is a British person putting on an American accent. Obviously, there are some British actors who have like flawless accents, but I feel like there are many, and I think Benedict Cumberbatch is one of them. Who, as great of an actor as he is, he's like not. He's clearly not an American when he speaks.
I've looked at a few of his American accents, and you can always tell it, but it's not what he does with the accent. I quite literally think it's like the timbre of his voice. Like you can't get rid of it.
Yeah,
it's very like a bassy and like strong sound to it. But I think the accent comes across just as fine. Like if you didn't know Benedict Cumberbatch, you wouldn't notice it.
Yeah, I'm glad that he didn't.
That's without that definitely adds to it. The fact that he's so iconic as
you see him in other things, and so
it's like it's sort of like it's a bit unfair, like what I'm saying.
I'm glad that he didn't like lean into a drawl or anything. He just stuck with what he knows works for his voice.
I think
it added to the character
too. Like because this was 1920s or something.
25.
Yeah. So it's not like very old. And I think that's sort of an interesting point in it, is that like he's a rancher man. He doesn't like to shower, doesn't like to change and stuff. And sort of it's the evolution of like animals, and like that being the main transportation, a lot of things. There's lots of uses for cattle, and you see cars, and sort of it's the changing of like sort of man to machine in a way.
Yeah, the old ways were more in the ground than on top of it by that point, and like the modernity was sort of coming in by then.
Yeah, and you can see like Phil is very, he's resistant for a lot of reasons, but one of them I think is like he's a rancher. He's used to the nature, the land, the animals. His cars are foreign to him, and washing and presenting himself for people. It's a foreign concept to him. He's still living the old Wild West sort of life, even if other people aren't.
Well, I think that creates a very, and I'm going to use this word again, authentic relationship between Phil and characters like Rose and Peter, and even his brother George, who is sort of moving into this, yes, we're ranchers and we move cattle and we live out on all of this land, but also we're going to meet and have dinner with the governor and have sort of this more civilized lifestyle now that I'm married and there's a kid involved. And I think bringing Phil into more of a modern world, as you were saying, showed maybe what Benedict Cumberbatch wasn't saying, but really showed what was underneath in his perspective, in his character's perspective on the world.
Like just as like a minor detail thing, did you guys pick up on how exactly George managed to invite the governor to his house? Kind of like that's like it's kind of just like, oh, the governor of Montana just suddenly coming. It was an interesting plot.
I think it was that like they're very well off, like a well-known family, and I think it was that they had just gotten married, so it was a cordial thing.
That makes sense.
I don't know if it was like specifically explained, but I would imagine, you know, they're a well family. One of them just got married.
Yeah. Oh, and also, I gotta say, speaking of them getting married and all that, the scene, it was like brilliant and all that, how it was done, but the scene of Kirsten Dunst's character Rose, like being asked to play the piano and like not knowing, like as someone who would like to know the piano but has never quite known how to play it, unlike some other people here, it struck a certain chord with me, but it was also very well done.
Struck a chord.
I think it was very poignant also in that like she was expected not just to be a wife, but to like provide something and also to like show what she knew. You know, they talk about like all the things that reading and stuff. They're very educated people. And even like Phil and all his dirt, you know, he's there on the banjo, like perfectly playing everything that she's trying to play.
Yeah.
You can see that they are very educated. They come from very educated backgrounds, very well off backgrounds. And Rose does not. And she also is, you know, piano is not something, she hasn't had a piano. She hasn't been able to practice like these people. And she feels like expected to provide something. I think it was a very interesting in relation to like ranchers, which are, you know, very physical work and like you show what you do essentially.
Okay. I thought it was also just an interesting character parallel, the fact that Phil Peter is a med student and Phil was like what was it, like magna cum laude at Yale for classics or something like that. Like it doesn't come up like at all. It hasn't come up at all prior to that moment, and so it's like it's sort of like, wait, oh, they're actually both very intelligent people.
And it's in different ways too, right? Like Phil being educated in the classics is sort of like the old world. And then this new cosmopolitan lifestyle that Peter is being brought up in is the sciences and medicine. You know, it's 1925. We've got vaccines and medical breakthroughs happening at the exact same time that there are cars driving through these old dusty towns. And so it is, I mean, they're pretty, I think I would call them pretty good foils of one another within the film. And they play off of each other brilliantly throughout the entire course of their relationship.
Yeah, that definitely gets stronger as the film goes on. You don't really see much of it beyond, you know, Phil making fun of Peter in the first act. Then the second act, you know, they get a little bit more familiar when Rose and Peter move into the house, move onto the ranch. And then sort of the turn where you get into that third act where it really starts to hone in on that relationship is when Phil sort of, I wouldn't say takes a liking to Peter, but he sort of takes him under his wing when he's being made fun of with all the other ranchers. And I think that turning point for their relationship, whether it was a friendship or a partnership or father-son figures for each other, or
projection
even something
of his own insecurities.
Yeah. Any way you look at that relationship, I think the onus of development of their connection fell on each of them in a different way. And you could really see each of them grow with their character, or rather each of their characters grow as they, just as individuals, as they grew their relationship.
Yeah. Also, just point out, I found it interesting, like similar to that point about how the film becomes about Phil and Peter's relationship. I feel like by the last third, George as a character almost like not disappears, but like vastly decreases, I feel, in prominence in the story in the third act. I mean, not vastly, but like it just, I felt like when I started watching the film, I felt like it could have been him, George, being the main character, like without like knowing what would happen. But then, of course, it eventually settled, and it's like, Phil is the main character and all that. But I thought it was an interesting thing for George's presence. I feel like he has lots of presence, and then like not a lot of presence. It was an interesting aspect of the movie.
Yeah, it's a great performance by Jesse Plemons. I don't know if you guys know this, but Paul Dano was originally attached to star as George, but had to leave the project because he was scheduled to appear as the Riddler in the Batman. So scheduling conflicts, he dropped out. Jesse Plemons stepped in. I've enjoyed him more in other performances. He was great in The Irishman. Obviously, I love him in Game Night. He has a lot of range. He's a really talented actor. I thought that
really obscure show Breaking Bad. It's like he did a good performance there as well.
How do you mute someone? Yeah, I mean he shows a lot of range within this character, within this role, that maybe he's needed more, as you were saying, Declan. His character is needed a little bit more in the first half of the film, and then once you get into later in the second act and the third act, it's more about Phil and Peter at that point. And I think George is allowed to take a step back and let his brother and his, we'll call him stepson, take the forefront in the story, because their relationship is more important at this point to the audience and to the filmmakers than the relationship between George and Rose.
Yeah, and I think it's also George, like, just practically probably really busy with Rose being an alcoholic.
Yeah.
I think
and what a performance by Kirsten Dunst.
Yeah, no, she was very good. And it also like plays off of like, where Peter goes. He spends more time with Phil because she's an alcoholic. So I think it's sort of the starting point for a lot of these characters go in different directions. And I think George is just an all around solid guy. He doesn't have a place in this story really.
But at the same time, he's looking out for everybody, right?
Yeah, exactly.
He cares about
his wife,
everyone.
So like,
yeah,
he's not worried about what Phil and Peter are doing. He looks at the best in everyone too. He never sees anything wrong with like Phil, taking in Peter.
Because why would he, right? Like it's his brother.
You trust him.
He has no reason not to trust him. I mean, Phil doesn't really do anything that is inappropriate to Peter. I mean, he's not very nice to him at the beginning of the film and sort of even through the first half. But as their relationship grows and Phil starts to, I think, take a liking to Peter, there's some real mentorship there, right? There's some real fatherly activities that they embark on, horseback riding, knots, and all this other braiding of the saddles and everything. So there's lots of real moments that are cultivated between the two of them, and Benedict Cumberbatch's character kind of slides into that father figure role that Jesse Plemons' George does not, because he's dealing with Kirsten Dunst and her being an alcoholic, with his job, all these other things. And I think that is something that Phil probably picked up on and ended up being a really nice part of the story.
Yeah. One more note on the cast before we move on here. I've got a couple of questions for the group here. But Thomasin McKenzie is in this film almost off to the side in a sense. But her character Lola works on the ranch. She's sort of involved, you see her referee the two the two-shot tennis match. She's sort of, involved in the house and
Don't
housekeeping.
give the rabbit a carrot. but then
Yeah, I
just
was about
Yeah.
to say, tried to take a carrot.
That scene
That
took
was
a very
awesome.
fast turn.
Yeah.
I want to
think-
talk about that one later because I think it's
Yeah.
an interesting scene.
With the name recognition at this point, Thomas and Mackenzie, she's been in, Jojo Rabbit, Last Night in Soho. She's a very recognizable name at this point. To see her sort of off to the side, I was personally expecting more from her. What do you guys think about her performance here and the size quality of her role or her appearance in the film?
I don't know. I mean, frankly, I thought everyone else had just the right amount of time. It really shouldn't have involved many other people for too long because, again, like the story is mainly about Peter and Phil and Rose to a certain extent. She is the reason why it seems like Peter's doing a lot of the stuff. I feel like she had enough time to, play a supporting role and help Rose essentially. A little bit of, I guess, I don't know how to put this. Yeah, the whole carrot thing. She shows up in some scenes, but I mean, I don't think that she should have been a character that would like take over a scene or anything. I think it's the right amount of time. I mean, how much time did she have compared to like Jesse Plemons?
I would say Jesse Plemons was featured more.
Yeah.
Just a rough estimate.
She was pretty prominent in like the middle of the film, though.
I feel like
I guess you
it
could
was
say that.
Yeah, I feel like it was just interesting how I almost felt like she was in some way like a red herring, like given that she is such a prominent actress, like to just see her in the background, you think like, oh, okay, maybe I was like before the themes of the film became more apparent, I was like, oh, is she gonna be some sort of like pseudo romantic interest for Peter or something like that? But then no, it goes a completely different direction there. So it was interesting to see. I wonder if it was like she really wanted to work with this director and so yeah, I don't know. But yeah, no, but you're right though that it's like what place would she have had in the story?
Yeah. I don't know what else you would have done with her. I mean, you could put anyone in that role.
Yeah.
Frankly, I really don't like when movies get a really, great actor and put them too much in the movie when like it's clear they shouldn't have been in the movie that long. Just because they're a prominent actor. I think the movie would have suffered if you gave like too much time to like any of the other actors. I mean, the whole like latter half of the movie was mainly just Phil and Peter, and the Native Americans that came to take the saddles, the hides or whatever.
The hides. So now, having seen it, I have a question, really for Ben and Max, but Declan, there's a way of adjusting it for you as well. Now that we're talking it out a little bit, what about this film, Ben, I'll let you go first on this one. What about this film made it your favorite film of 2021?
I mean, a lot of things. There's really great performances, but also it was another one of those movies like The Last Duel that takes something typical, like a Wild West story, but it's not a Western. It really isn't. There's no elements of a Western, but like it appears sort of like a Western. You got these branching brothers and stuff. Similar to The Last Duel, it appears like the historical drama about duel and stuff, but it turns the issues that you would expect them to face on their head, where it's really a lot more about sexuality, and also, like I said before, there's the whole industrial revolution going on, and I always like the ending quote is whatever, deliver my darling from the sword, the power of the dog. I thought there was it kind of worked. The sword is like machine, Power the dog, like Phil, they're incompatible. And these characters were going in different directions, and they were incompatible with each other. I mean, Phil's sort of stuck in the past, and he's also stuck with his own like inner turmoil over, I guess, what sexuality he is, what he really thought of Bronco Henry. I mean, there's a lot of questions with him, but it's very clear like he's really conflicted inside, and he sort of takes Peter out. I sort of see it as like almost selfish in a way, especially at the end with like the hides. George goes like, oh, they're just extra hides. Why'd you need them? It was like, they're my hides. I needed them, but it's to complete the robe for Peter. And I always thought like all the stuff Bronco Henry did for him, he somehow feels like compelled to do it, maybe somewhat out of like respect for what he did, or what Bronco Henry did for Phil. But I also thought like he saw a bit of himself in Peter, and he was doing this more in a weird way, like for himself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a
I
lot
don't
of
know.
sense.
There's so much about this movie that I think you can really analyze, especially like Phil's ending. I said like in the favorite movies, I thought his character is poetic. And I think it really is. He's a disease to like everyone around him. And George is sort of the one person who, I guess, sort of has like gloves. He can sort of handle the disease. He doesn't really get impacted by it, but everyone else feels it, and they get worse and worse and worse. So it's
And then that sort of manifests itself with, I mean, it's very brief right at the end of the film, but that sort of manifests itself with Phil's death and the impact and legacy that he has on Peter and on George and on Rose.
Yeah.
So
I was gonna ask about what you thought, what everyone here thought was the root of Rose's alcoholism, but like your point about that was a good point about the curse, kind of.
Yeah, Phil 100%. I mean, he turns everyone.
Oh yeah.
The worst version of themselves, even Peter. I mean, Peter does it for like his mother, but he wouldn't have to do that without Phil. Like Phil really turns everyone worse, and it's only appropriate he's covered in dirt. He sort of makes everyone dirtier.
It's also appropriate that at that point George is, as we said, kind of absent from the story, that he quite literally within the confines of the storyline remains untouched by Phil's filth and sort of the bad things that he brings with him. It's also really interesting, the scene by the river, where I won't get into too much detail, but Phil reminisces about Bronco Henry by what is ostensibly a place where one gets clean. And he does get in the water, and yet he still emerges, or has emerged, as someone who is still covered in these scars, these these vices that he's bringing upon his own family. And George, to go back to your original question of why it landed in my top 5 and why it was my number 2 movie of the year, I think it's a timeless story, right? Like something that Ben said during his remarks, like this could be made in 2022, like where there's a person who is living in a town or a city surrounded by people and things and technology advances and science that they don't understand. They don't want to let go of that. And I think we're living in a time period right now where that is very real. We're seeing that in our political discourse. We're seeing that in the way we talk about media, the way we talk about sport, the way we talk about art. It's in all these facets of our life. And that's what I think made this film so brilliant, is that it didn't have to be told in 1925, and yet it made it that much more powerful to see it sort of this linear, this timeline of okay, we can go all the way back to the 1920s and even further back to see stories like the ones we're seeing today, where people feel lost. They don't have any sense of their own self or any sense of their identity. And searching for it in the people around them is the only thing that they can do. And so what I took away from this film is that it's not necessarily a film about being lonely. It's about searching for people that can make you feel less alone.
Mm.
Mhm.
It was
Yeah.
a like remarkably beautiful scene where George dances with Rose in the field and then it's like walks away. It's like talks about it's like yeah, it's like as you said, it's like it's so nice not to feel alone anymore. It's just like it's almost out of nowhere. It's like not out of nowhere, but just it's an interesting scene, you know.
So Declan, coming up to you now. Where you watched this film for the first time, we're recording this Wednesday night. You watched this film for the first time earlier today. I did as well, just to have it fresh in mind for the episode.
Mm.
Would it fall in your top 5 if you had watched it last year, or in
The
your
thing
honorable
is-
mentions?
The thing is, of course, is that I do feel like it's difficult for me to determine stuff in my list like the day of. Like I'm sort of like as I think back on it, while I understand why I only put it as an honorable mention, I'm now thinking maybe Tick Tick Boom should have been in my top 5, but that's a whole nother story. So
Beautiful
it is,
film.
yeah, it's a fantastic film, and I'm realizing it deserved to be there, so this one, so it is fresh in my mind, so it is a bit difficult. That being said, I don't think I would have put it there. I felt like the other stories I talked about, I just gravitated more towards than this one because it's a film that I imagine I need to like sit on a bit and like think about more and like fully get sort of like many of Paul Thomas Anderson's films where it's like I feel like when I first watched it I was like this is good but I feel like there's more going on here and then like I think about it for 3 months and it's like, oh the Master's about Scientology. Oh, it's not actually. I mean, kind of, but sort of. There's a massive asterisk to that quote to that line there. Hey, but yes, but still, so I at this time I don't think it would have made my top 5 or honorable mention, but I can like we'll see how I feel 6 months from now is what I'll say.
Yeah. I'm pretty much right there with you. I can appreciate the greatness of the film.
Mhm.
Obviously, Jane Campion, with phenomenal direction. The scenery is gorgeous. The set construction, it really looks like the 1920s, especially with the cars.
And New Zealand look like Montana.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But for real, I think this is a really, really well-made film. The script is really tight. The story, as Max said, is timeless. There's a lot that people can latch on to as a way of connecting with the characters, connecting with the story. So I understand and can appreciate the strengths of this film in a way that will make it appealing to audiences and critics alike. But Declan, like you said, with the films that I listed for my top 5 and for my honorable mentions, I think, again, this is still very fresh in my mind and I might need more time to understand it. Those films had time to settle for me. So, ask me again in 6 months, I guess is what I'll say as well.
Yeah,
So,
I mean,
yeah, go on.
I think at least I gravitate towards films that are not necessarily the happiest. I mean, my favorite film of all time is probably Vertigo. Not the most depressing film.
Not
but-
Blade Runner?
No, that's probably the second. And neither of them are really happy films at all. Something for me, I always find the more things.
What are you talking about? Harrison Ford talks about how happy the ending is in the voiceover at
Oh,
the end
yeah.
of Blade Runner using the footage from The Shining.
Yeah, that really real happy ending.
No, sorry, I apologize. That was
It's fine. But sometimes like when things go so terribly wrong, like they sort of do in The Power of the Dog. There's a lot of room for like the human aspect to change. Like the people are radically different in this, and you don't really. I mean, I guess you're rooting against Phil in a way, but it's all sort of gray, very much like the Wild Wild West in a way, where it's like you can sort of sympathize with one way or the other, but there's just a lot to think about, I guess. I don't
Yeah.
feel good. There's not like a motivational, like, oh man, like, I don't feel good. Like even Spider-Man, as depressing as, that could be for a superhero movie, it's a fun movie, right? You come out of that, like, you have that gravitas from the film, but you also feel,
It's an enjoyable ride.
yeah, it's enjoyable. Some of these movies I find I don't enjoy them as much as it really makes me think about the characters and the themes and stuff. So those are always my favorite. And just another thing that I've been thinking about, like I think Max said, Phil and Peter are foils. Going back to the rabbit, there are two rabbits that die in this movie. One rabbit is first killed by Peter, killing it
In
so
the
that
pursuit of science.
in the pursuit of science, in the pursuit to help people. Now, the second rabbit that dies is put out of its misery because Phil has been just throwing sticks around and breaking his leg. He says, "Oh, well, I guess could just put it out of its misery." He has no care for other people's lives or other animals' lives. In the same way that, like, as much as Peter is killing Phil, he is also saving other people.
That is true. Sorry, it's just like that's a really good point about
Yeah, I thought it was really, really smart of them. They have two rabbits, or it's not rabbits, bunnies, or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, that really goes back to what you were saying earlier about Phil's effect on not just the people around him, but the world around him. Right?
That's the difference in like philosophy,
Yeah. So, Power of the Dog, final thoughts.
Deliver me from the power of the German Shepherd.
Speaking of German Shepherd, Ben, I texted you this while I was watching the movie. You could replace Benedict Cumberbatch in this film with a German Shepherd, and while the ending would be sadder, it would be the exact same story.
I think it'd be pretty hard to film some of those river scenes with the dog. I don't know.
The effect probably would be a bit lost.
That might actually just not be allowed to be shown.
Well, maybe we'll get that dog person relationship in that new Channing Tatum movie that's coming out later
It'll
this
be
month.
Power of the Dog Part 2.
Power of the Dogs.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
But yeah, I mean, final thoughts. I still love this film. I want to see it again. I probably should have watched it more recently than in 2021, and I realized that as we were talking about it when everything started to come back, and yet it was so fresh, right? Just talking about everything that happened and sort of diving into some of the symbolism and some of the things that we brought up. It really is just a great story, and I think it's a pretty brilliant meditation on loss and on isolation, as well as masculinity and insecurity, and sort of what that entails with the characters, and how human of an experience that is. And that's what I loved about the film, is how realistic the characters were.
Yeah. I mean, more than anything, they're really complex characters. I mean, they all have a lot going on, and there's lots of themes being explored. My friend
Lots
is,
of themes.
I'm going to watch the gay cowboy movie. That's what he referred to it as. Like, okay, I mean, sure, in a way, but like, there's a lot going on. Sure, there's the gay cowboy theme that's in there, but the characters are very complex. Authority, identity, I mean, addiction. Like, there's a lot that these characters are going through. So I just enjoy it. There's plenty of stuff that I can continue thinking about.
Declan, final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think I I feel like even just now, like hearing both Ben and Max talk about what they like so much about it has caused me to like realize more connections in the film than I had previously like noticed before. So I think that is it, that's indicative of it's like right now I feel like I just respect it rather than enjoy it. But I imagine as I think of as I let it settle a bit more, I imagine my enjoyment will rise for later. For now, it is just this is a great film, and I think you should watch it. But there are other stories from 2021 that I gravitated more
Yeah.
towards.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in the same boat right there. It's definitely a compelling watch. You know, as we've said countless times on this episode, it's very it deals with a lot of those themes that we've been talking about. There's something I think that everyone can find romantic or tragic about this in a way, and not just with the story, but with the undertones and the relationships and the characters and even the dialogue. Um, I think this is a really strongly made film from a technical standpoint, and you know it's the Golden Globe winner for motion picture drama, so we're gonna be following this one through award season as the SAG Awards come up and the Oscars coming up in March. So that's going to do it for this episode of Unqualified Film Bros. We will be back next week. We're going to be talking about another movie, one of the first releases of 2022. Get excited for that one. I'm not going to say what it is yet. So we will see you next week. And in the meantime, Power of the Dog is streaming now on Netflix.
Go watch it. Tell us what you think.
Good night.
Have a good night,
See ya.
everyone.
Good night.